Okay. Hi, I see a few of you are on the page already. We're going to get started in about 3 to 5 minutes. While you're here, if you want to pop into the chat and just say hi, where you're from, I'd appreciate it. I'm going to come back when we're about to start and I'll do this announcement again, but I just figured I'd start streaming because I see a lot of you are already here. Okay. I'm responding to the chats, I swear. Okay, someone said they were having trouble with their audio, but everyone else, there were enough people that responded to me when I asked to say hello. So can you guys all hear me? I can't reach out to the chat if you don't chat with me first, but you guys can all hear me, right? Okay, audio's working fine. Cool, all right, awesome. Sweet, thank you guys. Sweet, sweet. Awesome, okay. All right, great, cool. So it's just about, it's a little after 10:30 my time, so I'm sorry for that. Oh, why does this keep switching? So it's a little after 10:30 my time. I'm sorry about that. So we're going to get started and dive right in. Thank you for everyone who already said hello in the chat. If you are viewing this on full screen mode, to get to the chat, you will just have to exit out of that. You won't really need it unless you want to ask a question, but just so you know, that's how you can get to it. If anyone else wants to say hello, where you're from, tell me your name, great. I'll give you a little bit of an intro about myself. Hi, my name's Bridget. I'm a photographer. I work out of New York City. I've been doing this for about 8 years. Before that, I was earning my BFA in photography. I've picked a lot of niches and I've never stuck to them, so I have a variety of experience in different fields. But what stayed consistent is my love of the art of photography, and sharing that with others, whether that's getting into discussions or teaching and learning. And that's kind of why I'm doing this class today. I think it's great that we have so much free material education available to us now with the internet. I do think it's a little bit helpful when you can get a live class so you can ask a question in real time rather than leave a comment on a website. But also I think sometimes when we're self-learning, we get so concerned with doing it right, like getting the right exposure, the right settings on the camera, that we forget photography can be a really expressive artistic medium. But we do have to start with the basics and learning how to work our camera. So that's why I'm going to do this today. My upsell, because I know there's always like an upsell for the free things, I'm just going to ask you to join a Facebook community that I run. It is also free, and I'm going to tell you about future classes that I'm going to be doing online. All right, so with that, we're going to get started. This was the welcome slide. Whoops. So keep in mind, we're going over the 3 basic settings that together are referred to as the exposure triangle. This, if we were in a formal education setting like college or high school, this would be a couple of weeks in a semester-long course. So I'm doing this in about an hour. It's meant to be an introduction to help you keep learning. If you have questions at any time, put them in the chat. I'm not going to get to them until the very end. I know that's how I am. I'm not going to be able to multitask and get into the chat and keep going. So at the very end, I will do a Q&A. Whenever you have questions, just pop them in the chat, and we'll see them later. All right. So the exposure triangle are the 3 settings on your camera if you're shooting in manual mode. I know a few of you said you just have a cell phone. If you want to play around with these, there are free apps you can download that let you change these settings. The 3 settings are ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. They each control how much light can get into your camera and activate the sensor to imprint a photo, right? Together they give you an exposure, which is, it's your image and it's how light or dark that is. And it's a balance. When you change one setting to let more light in, you can change one of the others to cut light out. And that way it's a balance and you're gonna keep the even exposure that you want. I'm gonna talk about each setting, what they do, how they control the light, their secondary control, and we're gonna try to reinforce the relationship that they have with each other. Okay. So I'm going to start with ISO. ISO, it's the agreed upon abbreviation for International Organization of Standards. It is agreed upon, so it's standardized internationally, so that way it's not a different acronym in English or French, etc. I have a habit of setting my ISO first because I was taught you set it based on the environment you're shooting in. That is a carryover from film days. If you're picking a roll of film, it's the chemical emulsion. It's how sensitive that is. And so you wouldn't be able to change your ISO. So I know this is a habit of mine that I pick my ISO first based on the environment I'm shooting in. I still think it's really helpful, but there's no right or wrong order to how you set these, okay? Okay. So ISO is how sensitive or reactive, you're starting off. For digital cameras, you're choosing how sensitive or reactive your sensor plate is. Again, selecting it based on the environment you're shooting, meaning how bright or dark of an environment you're shooting in. So if you have a lot of light and you're in a really bright situation, so think outside, midday, super sunny, you don't need a high ISO, aka high sensitivity. You can shoot on 100, 200. If you're in a darkly lit environment, so maybe outside at night or inside minimal light, candlelight, etc., you would push your ISO up so that it's more sensitive because it can react with less light present. So more sensitive ISOs are closer to 6400. And I do, that way, and I do have a little scale here showing you full stop ISO increments, going from 100, 200, 400, etc. up to 6400. Bum, 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 bum. Excuse me, I'm looking at notes. Okay, so the secondary control of ISO is how noisy your image is going to be. Sorry, I'm just check the chat for a second. Where is my place? Thank you for being with me. Okay, the secondary control is how noisy your image is going to be, right? So think of that digital pixelation. If it was film, it would be film grain. A higher ISO, you will inherently have a little bit more noise to start off with. And a lower ISO, meaning closer to 100, you'll have less to start off with. But if you're getting the exposure you want, or as close as possible to the exposure you want in camera, you really shouldn't have to worry about the noise of a higher ISO. A lot of digital cameras, every brand has a different processor has a different processor which will help how it handles low light on a higher ISO. But typically, if you want to start watching out for it when you hit 1600 or higher, just pay attention to it. Again, the real issue with noise is if you shoot too dark of an image, you underexpose your image, and you go to edit it and your ISO is too high, you'll start to see the image degrade in the darks. Okay, so starting with exposure, I'm going to quickly switch my screen. I have a capture set up. So these are some images I took just before we started. I have this still life set up. I'm going to, hopefully this works. I'm going to take another one right now. Awesome. Okay. So, starting here, we have on my left-hand side of the screen, you should be able to see that I have my settings. ISO is at 800, shutter speed's 1/25th, aperture 8, which don't worry, we're going to get to those settings in a second. So right now, my image is dark, and if I want to change that by adjusting my ISO, I'm going to go to a more sensitive ISO. I'm going to go up in ISO. So from 800, I'm going to go to 1600, and I'll take a photo to show you what that looks like. Awesome. See, so already the image is getting brighter and closer to what I want. And then I'm just going to practice. I'm going to go up to 3200. Awesome. And that's really bright. Like, I'm getting more detail. I can see more definition. So compared, we started at 800 ISO, and I've gone up to 3200 now. I wanted my image to get brighter, so I made my ISO more sensitive. Okay. Sweet. So I'm going to switch back now. Okay. So we're going to go on in the presentation. All right, and next we're going to talk about shutter speed. So shutter speed is how long your camera is open, or how long you're allowing light to come in and hit the sensor. It's typically measured in fractions of a second. So if you look at your camera, it might just say 1,500, 250, but those are actually fractions of a second. So they're 1/100th of a second, right? Like point whatever decimals of a second. They're really, really fast. Those are fast shutter speeds. Faster shutter speeds, it's less light and it's open for a shorter amount of time, so it's a shorter exposure. You can go on the opposite end of that, and again, I have a scale over here of shutter speeds in full stop increments. So you can go on the slower end, closer to like 1/30, 1/8, 1/4, etc. And those are slower shutter speeds, so they're close. 1/4 is a quarter of a second. Most cameras you can go all the way down to a second, and then there's a bulb function where you can hold it open for however long you want. The secondary control of shutter speed is how motion is depicted in your image. So it's either frozen or blurred. Right, you might hear motion blur get mentioned, and that can be intentional or unintentional. If your shutter speed is lower than 1/60th of a second, and this is not end all be all. Some people it might be, you might need to keep it a little bit higher, like 1/100th, or you can go a little lower, like 1/30th. Also will vary depending on the weight and focal length of your lens. But typically 1/60th. If you go any slower, you want to make sure that you're bracing the camera, because even just the movement, the little tiny movement of your hands not being stabilized, will get picked up on the camera, and you'll see it'll look like just a blur of color and light. So you should test that out to see where your stop is. I know I drink a lot of coffee, so I typically need to keep my shutter speed higher because I'm a bit more jittery. But 1/60th is kind of a good place to start if you're not sure. So I'm going to switch again to the capture screen. So I bumped my ISO down again to 800 because we're going to start changing with the shutter speed. So all of these objects are still, they're not moving. So if I slow my shutter speed down, because I'm going to show you right now, that at 1/25th of a second, this is a dark image. So if I want to make it lighter by changing my shutter speed, I would have to slow it down, right? Think of this as like a faucet. If you turn on a faucet and you keep it on for 30 seconds, more water will flow through compared to just holding it open for 20 seconds, right? So if you think about that, how much light you're letting in, if you have your shutter open for longer, more light passes through. If you have your shutter open for less time, less light passes through. So I want to slow down my shutter speed, so I'm going to go to 1/30th of a second just to see what that does. Okay, great. Like, I think that's going back to where I want this image to be exposed. Now, to practice motion blur, I've tied a picture of a butterfly on a string. And we're going to take a quick photo. I changed my shutter speed back up to 125. Cool, so it's a little dark. Hold on, let me get this. All right, great. So I have a little butterfly on a string. At 1/25th, you can't tell that it's moving, right? So now I'm going to change it again. I'm going to slow down my shutter speed. I'm going to slow it all the way down to half a second. And I have to change my other settings to compensate, but don't worry, we'll go over that. All right, so now I have my shutter speed down to half a second. And my butterfly is swinging and, well, okay. So do you see that blur of color compared to where the butterfly was before? Because I know you couldn't see it, but it was moving, it was swinging on that string. So with a fast enough shutter speed, I froze that movement, and with a slower shutter speed, I was able to capture motion blur and kind of the path that that object was following. All right, we're going to cut out of that. Awesome. So shutter speed, how long your camera's open for, controls motion blur. The next setting we're going to get to is aperture. And aperture is the size of the opening in your camera lens. A bigger aperture, right? Bigger opening, more of the lens is open. Ooh, smaller aperture, it's just that tiny little opening, right? The aperture is in your lens and not your camera body. So if you have an interchangeable lens system, the aperture is in there, and you can purchase lenses that have a specific minimum or maximum aperture, depending on what you're going for. Aperture is measured in increments called f-stops. The smaller the numerical value of the f-stop, so like 1.4, 2, etc., those are actually bigger openings, right? And if you go on the opposite, which again, I have a scale over here with f-stops in full stop increments, 22 and 32 are like super tiny, right? Can you even look through that part of my finger? Those would be really tiny apertures. I know when I was first starting, this was confusing for me, and it took me a while to get into the habit of calling larger f-stops with a smaller number. So what helped me is when I started to think about how much light it's blocking, right? Because if it's covering more of the lens, it's going to block more light. So 22, 16, they're going to block more light than an f4, an f2, etc. So the secondary control of the aperture is depth of field. This is what everyone loves. This is how you get bokeh, etc. Depth of field is characterized as shallow or deep. Shallow being only part of your image is in focus and you can tell other parts are blurred. Deep would be that everything is in focus. There are other factors that will play into depth of field. Your focal length will play into it for one. But because we're just doing a basic intro and aperture is the main control of depth of field, that's what we're talking about today. If you want a shallower depth of field, you want to set your aperture to a bigger size, right? So keeping closer to 1.4, 2, etc. That will give you a shallower depth of field. Whereas if you want everything in focus, you want a smaller aperture, so you'd go on the other end of the scale, go towards f32, etc. Your depth of field and what's in focus will depend on where your focal point is, right? Because the range of depth of field is going to change from your focal point. It'll grow towards your camera and away from your camera starting at your focal point. And now I'm going to show you a couple of photos in a second to demonstrate that. But like if I have an aperture of 2, right? And let's say it gives me this much of my image in focus. If I go to a 22, I'm going to get a bigger span of my image in focus, right? I'm going to switch, and we're going to demonstrate how changing your aperture will affect depth of field. So just give me a second. Boop. Wonderful. All right. There's our blurry butterfly. Okay, so right now I'm at f8. f8 and 5.6, they're usually a mid-ground when it comes to depth of field. And again, this will change a little bit depending on your focal length, but typically anything below 5.6, you will see a shallow depth of field. Anything 8 and above, you're probably going to get the majority of your picture in focus. All right, so I'm going to start with the aperture at f8. And I'm just switching some other settings. Don't worry, we're going to get to the relationship and I'll explain what I'm doing. Okay, and I'm going to go to ISO 800. 1/60th of a second, aperture 8. Okay, now I'm going to take the photo, and it's a little dark, so I'll slow my shutter speed a bit. You know what, no, we'll wait for that. Okay, so I'll slow my shutter speed a bit. Great, now if you're looking at the photo, the skull is my focal point right now. That's what I've set my camera to focus on. If I move it to focus on the little branch in the background, let's see, where's that wood? There it is. Okay, you can see there's a slight difference, right? It is a bit of a shallow depth of field because both the skull and the piece of wood in the back are not in focus. We can still tell what they are. So I'm going to change my aperture to 4. I'm going to cut out the light that I just let in with my shutter speed. I'm going to stay focused on the background, and I'm going to take this image again. It's too dark. Right, cool. Now do you see how the skull changed? This is aperture 4, and if we go back, this is aperture 8. You see the skull, it's still more in focus, and here it's blurred, right? Because I've set my focus point up on the wood in the background. So now I'm going to go in reverse. I'm going to go up to 22 for the aperture. And let's see what that does. All right, so what you should be able to see is that even though my focus point is on the background, the wood in the background, the skull is now looking more in focus. It's looking sharper, right? It's definitely, sharper than aperture 4, and it's even sharper than at aperture 8. All I did was change the aperture to get this effect, right? So I deepened my depth of field by closing down my aperture. Okay. All right, so we're coming back. So as I was changing the settings, you may have noticed that I also, when I changed my shutter speed to demonstrate motion blur, when I changed my aperture to demonstrate depth of field, you may have noticed that I had to make other changes elsewhere, right? These three settings balance each other out to give you an exposure, right? An exposure is how bright or dark your image is. When we are shooting on a cell phone or a camera in auto mode, the camera is trying to calculate these three different settings based on how much light is available. So when I want to change one setting, I will have to compensate for how much light I'm adding or taking away on one of the others. So let's say I take a photo and I start with these three settings of 400 ISO, shutter speed 125, and an aperture of f6. Let's say I want a shallower depth of field. So I want to move my aperture from 5.6 down to 2.8. Well, I know that if I move my aperture, I will get a shallower depth of field, but I'm also going to let in light. So I need to compensate for that. If I'm going to let more light in with my aperture, I need to cut light out on my shutter speed. So that would turn into an ISO of 400, shutter speed of 500, and an aperture of 2.8. If you are moving your settings in full stop increments, you can take that number and switch it to your other setting, right? Does that make sense? So I knew that I wanted to go from a 5.6 to a 2.8. On this scale of full stops, I can see that's 2 full stops on the aperture, and I will be letting in more light. So to balance it out, I need to cut light by 2 stops on my shutter speed. So that's why I knew I could go from 1/25 to 500. Make sense? Okay, we're gonna demo that a little bit again, and I'm gonna go slower and talk about why I'm changing all the other settings. Oh no, is the camera disconnected? Hold on, technical difficulties. Yeah, perfect. All right. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So this is not the exposure I want. Let's try here. Let's see what this gives me. Okay. So my settings are shutter speed of 1/8, aperture f16, ISO 800. I like this exposure. You know, I think it's fine. My highlights, my bright spots, I don't think they're too bright, and I like the shadows, what I'm getting. So I think this is fine. Maybe a smidge sharper, but I'll say this is fine for demonstration purposes. But I have a pretty small aperture, and I would like a shallower depth of field. I want to get just the skull in focus and have the background blurred out. So the lens I have on right now, the biggest aperture I have only is a 4. So I'm going to change a 4. I'm going from 16 to a 4, and I know that is 1, 2, 3, 4. That is 4 stops of light that I've changed and that I'm now letting in. If I just change my aperture, whoa, that's really bright. You can see, you know, part of my apartment beyond this little backdrop. This is overexposed. It's too bright, right? So I know that I just let 4 stops of light in by moving my aperture. So I need to cut 4 stops out on my shutter speed. Okay, so I know that 4 stops from 1/8. I'll be cutting light out if I go faster because it's going to let less light pass through. So I'm going to go from 1/8, 15 is 1 stop, 30, 60, 125. Okay, so this should give me really close to the exposure we had before, if not the exact same. Awesome. Look at that. Right? So overall, we would say the exposures are about the same because of how bright the image is, or how dark the image is. I do need to change my focal point so I can get just the skull in focus and blur out the background. Okay. Sweet. Awesome. All right. That is great. And then just to do it one more time, I like this exposure. I'm at 125th for shutter speed. My aperture is a 4. Let's say I wanted to get some motion blur, right? Or I just wanted a slower shutter speed. So if I go reverse, let's say I cut 3 stops on my shutter speed, so I change it from 125th to 115th, I need to add 3 on my aperture. So I go from 4, 5, 6, 8, and 11. Okay, so let's cut that. Sweet. Awesome. So you see the background is coming a little bit more into focus by changing the aperture. And even though this one is at f11 and a 1/15th of a second, it's the same overall brightness, aka exposure, as the previous one. Cool. Now, you may have realized that your camera has more apertures than this, or more shutter speeds available, and even ISOs that are in between those full stops. Those are they're called quarter stops or half stops. And you can still figure it out if you line them all up on a scale. You can figure out how to move them, figure out if you're moving 1.5 stops on aperture, move 1.5 stops on shutter speed, etc. I found ISO doesn't translate exactly by stops, but there's no shame in you just fiddling with the settings and figuring out which is good for you, right? This is just to help you understand the relationship, and if you need to quickly adjust between shutter speed and aperture, that should do it. Okay, so I have 3 different activities that I'm going to suggest you go out and do on your own after this presentation, and they're each focusing on one of the 3 different settings from the triangle. So the first one is practicing aperture, and we're calling it ducks in a row. So you can go out and find or pull together objects and line them up in a row, like I have the colored pencils over here. You're going to take 3 photos with your biggest aperture, right? So smallest f-stop, biggest aperture. You're going to focus on one object that's in the foreground or closest to you, then the middle, and then the farthest object, right? And at the larger aperture, you're going to see that depth of field and that focal point change. Then what I want you to do is pick the line of your repeating objects, pick the middle, and then you're going to start taking photos changing your aperture. So you're going from your biggest aperture, right, to your smallest aperture. So on my camera lens that I have today, that would mean I go from 4 to 5, 6, to 8, 11, 16, and stop at 22. And what you should see, the top picture, that's with the bigger aperture, and you can see my focus point in the back, really sharp blue pencil. Moving towards the front, we see that it's out of focus and we have a shallow depth of field. The one below is a smaller aperture, so f22, and we can see even though my camera is set to focus still on that blue pencil, all of them look in focus compared to the top image. Okay. The second activity is just getting 2 shots, and this is more about figuring your shutter speed and how you can incorporate moving objects into your image. So the shot list, you want a panning image and a long exposure. So for a long exposure, your subject's moving, that's going to be blurred, right? So just like how I did the butterfly, that's what you need to do. Your shutter speed will need to be slow enough to capture the movement. Again, rule of thumb, anything under a 60th, so try a 30th, 15th, 8th, etc. Just remember to brace your camera or your phone. If it's on a tripod, great. If you don't have that, just put it on a table, put it on the ground. Some surface where it's sturdy, where it's not going to jostle as much. Okay. And then the reverse of that is panning, which is going to be like the image over on the screen. You're going to follow the moving subject and get the background to blur out. Now you're going to have to play with which shutter speed works for this. This one I think was 1/25th, and I borrowed this image though, so I'm not 100% sure. But it's about 1/25th for shutter speed, and you're going to hold your camera and you're going to try to move with your subject, right? So you can capture them so that they look still and frozen, but your background is blurred. And then the last one I'm calling ISO Bingo, and there will be a follow-up email with a survey and everything, and I'm going to send you the bingo cards if you want to go play this game. But ISO Bingo, it's a challenge to set your camera first, and then don't change it until you get a good photo, right? So going across the top, you have your shutter speed selections. Going down the column, you have apertures, and then you would pick the ISO from the square. So if I wanted to, let's say the second column, right top, that is shutter speed of 130, ISO 6400, and aperture 2.8. So going back to what we talked about on ISO, picking that for your environment, that's going to give me a clue as to where I should start, right? So, and especially with these settings, 1/60th of a second and a really big aperture, 2.8, I automatically think, okay, that's letting a lot of light into my camera, so I should start off in a darker environment. That way it won't get overexposed, right? And so if you set your camera to these settings and then go out and try to take a photo and get the exposure that you like, I think it helps reverse our thinking a little bit. So it's just extra practice. But yeah, and then I'd love it if you could share your photos, share your bingo card if you do go out and do it. I have a Facebook group, like I said, I run. It's called Imperfect Photography. I'll send a link, but if you also want to search it, it's a free group. It's fun. We try to do a weekly photo contest. I try to do quarterly challenges and giveaways, and I'll post tutorials and articles on a weekly basis. So it's meant to be fun. It's meant to be more about experimenting and trying photography rather than worrying about getting it right. I also, in addition to starting this little community on Facebook, I also want to keep growing the community through education. So I'm planning on doing more workshops this year. I'm going to try to do it once a month. The next one's planned for February 26th, same time, same channel. And that one is photo basics, but it's about composition. So we're going to talk about rule of thirds, positive and negative space, shape and form in the photograph, lines, tone, color, etc. And that's more of an introduction to another artistic side of photography. I would love it if you guys want to put your social media handles in the chat. Great. Or go find me on Instagram. My handle's below at bhaggertyphoto. You're already on my website, but by this time next week, I will have a new design up, a new site up, and I'm hoping to have a video library of classes like this and tutorials, etc. Okay, so I've been hearing the chat going off, so I'm going to go check if we have questions now. Thank you so much for sticking through to the end. It looks like we did it in about 45-ish minutes, so we're pretty good.